In Psalm 56, verse 8, the Bible mentions the psalmist's tears being placed into a bottle. Some people probably don't even know that's there. I never heard of that. Placing tears in a bottle. So the question is, what does it mean? Well, let's look at the verse very quickly first. Listen to what David writes. Thou tellest my wanderings. Now listen to this. Put thou my tears in thy bottle. Are they not in thy book? Wow. David tells God to put his tears in a bottle. What in the world is he talking about? Folks, did you know? Well, let's look at the background of the psalm first. When you look at verses 1 and 2, David is being afflicted by his enemies. And if you look into the title of the psalm, the enemies are the Philistines. They are the inhabitants of Gath. Twice in the life of David, he left the land of Israel and went into the land of the Philistines. And he went to the city of Gath. 1 Samuel 21, 1 Samuel 27. And in our study of 1 Samuel, we'll eventually get there and see what was going on to take David into those wicked cities. But folks, while he was there, he was afflicted by his enemies. He was tormented by his enemies. But yet David says, in those times I put my trust in the Almighty God. Verse 3. When he jumps down to verse 8, he is assured that God knows of everything that is going on in his life. Hear how he opens that verse. Thou tellest my wanderings. That little word tellest means this: to number, to take account. Folks, listen to me. Everything that's going on in our lives, God knows about. And when you and I are afflicted, when you and I are being persecuted, when you and I are being despised, when you and I are being mistreated by the enemy, guess what? God is keeping record of every one of those times in His book. He's an accountant and writing those things down. Isn't that something? And folks, it's right after he makes that statement that he then makes this prayer request to God. Put thou my tears, watch this, into thy bottle. Wow. Did you know that collecting tears in a bottle was a common practice in the ancient world? That's weird, isn't it? We don't do that. Anybody got a tear bottle? Anybody ever bought a tear bottle? Now see, we might have a niche out there in society. If we start that, you might get rich. Start selling tear bottles. But it was a common practice back then. Folks, in times of grief, in times of despair, in times of mourning, in times of sorrow, it was very common for these individuals to desire to collect their tears so that they could set them on a shelf and they'd look at that little bottle and it would remind them of that time that they went through that affliction. Those little bottles were made of extremely thin glass and they had a funnel at the top. Now, I'm trying to teach you how to make these, so if you sell them, you'll know what to sell. That little funnel was placed right under the eye as that individual was crying. And folks, those tears, there may only be 2 or 3 or 4 of them, but they would fall into that bottle and you could see them in that little bottle. And that little bottle was kept on a shelf and that individual will remember, that's the tears that I shed at the death of whomever. That's the tears that I shed when I was being afflicted by mine enemy. Those little bottles, look at that name. That's a toughie, isn't it? Lacrimatories. Folks, the meaning of that word in Latin is this: to shed tears. To shed tears. Now here's the point. David had many struggles when he was in that Philistine country. Many times that he was persecuted. And folks, that caused him to shed tears. And in the psalm, he asked God to collect those tears and to put them in his bottle, God's bottle. What's David saying, folks? David is making use of figurative language. And he's saying, God, I want you to collect my tears, and I want you to remember all the struggles and all the difficulties through which I went. Wow. It's pretty telling, isn't it? Folks, here's the lesson for us. When you and I struggle, when you and I weep, when you and I mourn, do you want God just to forget all of that? I don't. I want God to remember my hardships. I want God to remember my difficulties. And one of the most beautiful prayers you could pray would be the very same one that David prayed. When you're crying and you're afflicted and you're mourning, just pray to God and say, God, take my tears and collect them in thy bottle. Don't forget my grief and my sorrow and my pains. And that's all that David is asking God to do. He goes ahead and he affirms that in the last part of that verse. Are they not in thy book? Remember, God's taking account of our lives. And folks, let me tell you something. When God sees you struggling, and when He sees you down and weeping, He makes note of every struggle through which you go. That's a beautiful thought, isn't it?